Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back, as is Becky Kovach. We're talking all about Song of Susannah today, which is the 6th Dark Tower book, and I'm your host, Deanna Chapman, as always. Becky, nice to have you back on.
Hello.
I know you will not be doing the 7th book with us because the schedule is a little crazy for the Dark Tower books here because Stephen King decided to release 3 in a row.
Yeah, which was surprising considering there was a pretty big gap between some of the earlier books.
I think his accident that he had kind of rushed things along.
Yeah.
But to dive right in, this book picks up shortly after where Wolves of the Calla leaves off. We saw Susannah flee at the end of that book. We didn't see it, we read it, but you all know what I mean. And so a lot of this book is focusing on Susannah's character and Mia having the demon baby. And there's so much character work, I feel like, especially at the start of the book, that it almost feels unfair that there's an entire book titled after Susannah.
Yeah. I will say I did really enjoy getting to see more of her and learn more of who you get glimpses into her past and who she was before she was
Right.
Susannah throughout the book, and I really enjoyed that. It was interesting in this one because so much of the book is just these separate storylines. We saw a lot of talk about the Katet being broken in Wolves of Calla, and here that's kind of really taken effect because we have Roland and Eddie kind of off on their own. Susannah and Mia, who has become much more of a prominent figure, getting ready to deliver the chap, and then Jake and Father Callahan are off on their own. So we're kind of tossed back and forth between these varying stories that I'm assuming are all going to catch up to each other in the last book, right?
Yeah, the last book has so much information in it. I'm going to have fun trying to do that episode without someone yelling at me and being like, you didn't cover this.
Oh my God. I can't even imagine. I haven't started reading the 7th one yet, but it definitely feels like we're finally moving towards this epic conclusion.
Right. So where Mia escapes to is 1999 New York. And as someone who was never in New York in the 90s, I imagine it was still a very different feel than the New York of the 70s that we previously visited.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of technological advances between the 70s and the 90s
Yes.
that just those alone make New York such a different place from one time to the next. And it's a very different New York than Susannah grew up with because she was from much earlier. And Mia has never been to New York, so she's not sure what to expect either.
Right. And what Mia ultimately does is she basically delivers herself and Susannah by default to the Crimson King's henchmen. And this is where we see Jake Oy and Father Callahan trying to save her. And there's this connection still, even though everyone's kind of off in their own direction. And you can tell that Jake is trying so hard to connect with Susannah. And just through the way that King writes that, you can tell how difficult that specific task is for him.
Yeah, I mean, Jake is the one who's strongest in what they call the touch. So if anybody's going to be able to communicate with the others, it should be him. But we see him struggling a lot with that. And actually, Susannah does have a little bit of success in trying to reach Eddie. And I don't know if that's because of her emotional connection with Eddie and the fact that they are closer than the rest of the quartet. But she's the only one who manages to kind of get any sort of message across, and even that's broken at best. So we definitely see this fragmentation of their group.
Right. And the other important thing to note with Jake and Callahan's part of the story is that they take Black 13 and put it in a locker in the World Trade Center, and then it's implied that it's going to be buried when the towers fall. And that is something that is very surreal to read because they enter New York in 99, but by the time this book releases, it's 2004. So we know what happens between those 5 years. But the fact that King is implying that they kind of know that's going to happen, it's just weird.
Yeah, it's very strange.
And I don't think he does it in any sort of offensive way. It was just one of those things where you read it and it's like, oh, okay, we're going there.
Right. I don't even know that I made that connection because I knew what year the book takes place, but I didn't really think about when it was released. So until you pointed that out, I don't think I would have made that connection.
There's so many timelines too, though, like you said, because Roland and Eddie are in Maine in the 70s. So it is kind of hard to keep track of the timeline because now that you know, I can say this. I didn't want to say it in the Wolves of the Calla episode because I had already finished reading this or most of this, but Stephen King literally writes himself in as a character.
Yes. And I knew it was kind of coming just based on the way Wolves of Calla ended, but I didn't think that we would see him as a straight up character. I thought it'd be the kind of thing where we alluded to him and his existence. But here we actually see him as a person, and it brings on this whole existential crisis because from what Eddie and Roland can tell, he is writing their story.
And it's not finished yet.
So there's no way to know how it's going to end. And even when they come upon the house, King sees Roland and goes running because he feels like there's no way he could be here. I've made you up. You're not real.
It almost feels like King had a lot to work through himself at this point in his life because I mentioned the accident where he was hit by a van and people thought he wasn't going to make it. And he writes that into the story too. There's a part where it's like Stephen King died in 1999.
Mm-hmm. The very last chapter of the book are all just what look like journal entries from King. And even within that, he talks through his struggles with the Dark Tower series and how at times he felt like he would never go back to it. He'd never finish it. But then other times he feels like it just kind of flows out of him. He doesn't even make it up. He's the conduit for these stories.
It feels like this was the book where he was like, okay, I need to have sort of this cathartic moment and just get all of this on the page, even though it's going to come off a little strange to readers probably for him to insert himself in the book in such a major way. He definitely has a major part in this as far as him kind of revealing to Roland that I wrote you. You shouldn't be here. And all of the diary entries. And we've seen him put his own books, his own works into his other works, but never really in this way.
Right. This is the most direct he has ever been with it. And it also, him appearing as a character, they pointed out so many other things that I never would have picked up on because I haven't read his other works. The fact that the author of the what is it, Charlie the Choo Choo book?
Yeah.
Claudia Inez Bachman. Claudia Bachman is the wife of his pseudonym.
Yes.
Which I didn't know I didn't know he had a pseudonym. I didn't know he published anything other names. So that just is another little piece of himself that he kind of throws into the book, and something that if you're a huge King fan, you'll probably pick up on.
Yeah, so a little backstory for you with the Richard Bachman pen name. He basically did that so he could publish more books in a given year. Okay. So he was publishing as King and as Bachman at the same time. And the secret didn't last too terribly long. And he's kind of stopped using it as much since. It still was used after people found out about it, but I think some of the works may have already been written as Richard Bachman and they just hadn't been published yet.
Got it.
But in 4 or 5 books after this one, he releases a book with that pen name called Blaze, but the copy I have has both names on it. So it's people definitely knew by now.
People knew. Yeah.
People who had been following him closely, I should say.
Right. Well, that, like I said, that's just something that I never would have picked up on because the Dark Tower series is my first kind of experience with Stephen King as an author. And I don't know much about him beyond this series. So, like, the fact that Father Callahan was a character from one of his other books was something that I didn't realize until they made it blatantly obvious in the text.
Yeah, it's something that I think is one of those just little nods for people who have been following a long time. And it's not crucial for you to have that information to understand the story, really.
Right. It's just like something that's another little fun fact.
Yeah, so a lot of this story is we need to rescue Susannah, right? And the problem with that is it kind of makes her feel like the damsel in distress at times. And I don't think Susannah has ever, until this point, come across as that kind of character.
No, and even now, I don't know that she necessarily comes across as the damsel in distress because while her body has kind of been hijacked by Mia, she still asserts a lot of control and finds ways to get Mia to kind of listen to her and give her more information. And even when she seems like she's trapped, she still is finding ways to be helpful and to make it so that hopefully the rest of them will survive.
Yeah, and I say that in the sense that she knows she's going to need their help in order to be saved. It's not a situation where she alone can get through it. She needs all of them to come together in order for
Yes.
whatever plan they concoct to succeed.
Yes. It's very clear that, like, no matter what happens, if they are to have any chance of surviving all of them, they do need to be together.
So it's more that she's simply in distress, not necessarily a damsel as well.
She puts up a hell of a fight.
She does. And I like that. It's not like she just gives up and is like, they're going to come save me. I like that she keeps trying to do everything she can to save herself, even though she knows the likelihood of that happening is slim to none.
Right. She finds little ways to send them clues, like trying to get through to Eddie using the touch. I do love her visualization techniques in how she does that.
Right.
And kind of seeing this control room in her mind.
Yeah, that's not the first time King has used sort of these visualization aspects for characters. In Dreamcatcher, the characters, one in particular, has like a memory warehouse. And it's literally like a giant library in his head of where all his memories are kept.
Okay.
And
it reminds me.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, it reminds me a lot of, if you've ever watched Sherlock, the BBC series, he refers a lot to like his mind palace.
Yes.
Which is like where he stores all of his information.
Yeah, it's basically the same sort of thing. So in Dreamcatcher, it's like file cabinets and stuff is just filed away. And that idea comes up a little in Dr. Sleep as well. And I think it's just a clever way of allowing the readers to understand what is going on in someone's head at any given time. Because a mind palace or a memory warehouse, that's something a lot of people can understand when it's described that way.
Right. It's a little bit more organized.
Yeah.
And straightforward, I think.
Exactly. And Susannah is someone who is constantly determined and willing to make use of any information she can in order to help herself. Like you said, she's not just sitting around, and she is doing everything she can to be helpful. And I think that visualization allows her to do that at a higher level.
Yeah. I think it was in Wolves of Calla where Roland kind of pulls her aside and is like, I need you here because you're the one who sees things. Right. You notice things. So I think that it very much falls in line with what we've seen of her so far and who she is as a character and like how she's developed over the last few books.
Right. And Susannah even leaves behind a turtle that sort of lets Jake and Father Callahan know, hey, maybe we have a chance.
Yeah, I think that was also her way of giving them a chance.
Yes.
Like the turtle has these weird mystical properties that if somebody sees it, they are just kind of hypnotized by it. Because I guess in this world that they're in, this version of New York, the turtle represents the great turtle of like the beam that they've been following.
Yeah, and I should note that the demon baby doesn't actually arrive in this book, so to speak. It's like at the end,
No.
it's like, oh, she's giving birth and cut to all of the King Diaries.
Yeah, it's like, oh, and thus Mordred, son of Roland, was born. I'm like, oh, that's all we get. And then it like brings us right to King's journal entries.
Yeah, so it's certainly this journey for Susannah and Mia because Mia is the one who is bearing the child. And obviously, things happen on a different timeline with the demon baby. You know, it doesn't seem like she's been pregnant all that long, and it's like the demon is ready to pop out.
Yeah. Yeah, they kind of touch upon how they're not sure how long it'll take for a demon baby to be born. And I mean, Susannah doesn't even seem pregnant for the most part. She starts looking pregnant a little bit, and then it all just kind of goes away. And we talk about how her and Mia are linked, and the baby has slowly been transferred to Mia
Yeah,
because Mia does not possess the ability to actually conceive a child herself.
that part was fairly confusing because it's like, okay, you would think that Mia in this instance is the more dominant personality because she is able to at least walk better than Susannah and things like that. She's more mobile. And even though Susannah doesn't let that stop her by any means, it just feels like they were like, okay, well, we can't really just have Susannah have the demon baby. So this other personality came into it. And because we've seen different personalities already, to have this one come in this way, it was just a little jarring, I think, in Wolves of the Calla. And they at least do some more fleshing out with the personality here.
Right, because it seems like Mia isn't even necessarily one of Susannah's personalities in the same way that like Odetta and Detta
Right.
were. She is her own entity. It doesn't do a very great job of explaining what she is, just that she was originally something somewhat immortal, not a human.
It feels more like a
And she,
possession than a personality.
right, yes. And then she gives up her immortality for the ability to have a child.
Yeah. And I think this is the storyline that works better. It makes sense as to why this book was called Song of Susannah because you have so many things that need to be worked out between her and Mia throughout the entirety of this book. And then it feels like Roland's quest is almost the secondary one, which is odd because anytime Roland is involved with something, you would think it would be like the most important thing, but I don't think it is in this instance.
Right. Well, because Roland is essentially the main character of this series.
Yeah.
But in this case, it does really take a back seat to Mia and Susannah and this baby that is coming and will supposedly cause Roland's death.
Yeah, I think in this book, though, Jake is still kind of my favorite character.
Yeah.
It's really hard to not like Jake because he's so young and impressionable, but he's not as jaded and ruthless as all of the other characters.
Right. He still has that kind of childlike innocence to him, which even though he has been in battle, he has killed, like he is a kid.
Yeah.
And I think we see that really clearly in one of the first scenes that we get with him, which is him and Father Callahan landing in New York of 1999 and Oy almost getting hit by a car.
Right.
With something else that I thought was just very funny was we left Wolves of Calla. They had this very clear plan, or I guess it was beginning of this book, where Eddie and Roland were the ones who were going to go after Susannah, and Father Callahan and Jake were the ones who were going to go and search for Calvin Tower in the 70s so that they could purchase the lot with the rose. But as Ka would have it, their roles get reversed. We see Eddie and Roland ending up in Maine and Father Callahan and Jake in New York.
Yeah, I like that switch though, because it kind of subverts your expectations as to what Roland's role is going to be throughout this.
Yeah. And it also kind of makes Eddie just accept that, like, whatever is going to happen is going to happen. There's no real way to control it.
I also love that when Roland and Eddie are dropped into 1977, it's in the middle of an ambush.
Yeah.
That just seems very fitting for Roland, especially in that moment, because it's like you can't just have Roland arrive and get what he wants. You got to have some speed bumps for them to hit.
Right. It also kind of brings things not full circle for Eddie, but when Roland originally draws him through the door, they kind of leave amidst like this huge gun battle. So Eddie leaves the world under gunfire and he kind of enters back into it in the same way.
Yeah, and you have these sort of mini battles happening throughout this story, because then you have Jake and Father Callahan gearing up and getting ready to go into the Dixie Pig, which is where Susannah is being held. And this is where the low men come into play a little more, because the low men, they appeared in Hearts in Atlantis, and they're these sort of human-looking creatures, and they are called the Cantoi.
Yes, that sounds right.
And because they're able to pass as humans, they kind of go undetected, because in Hearts in Atlantis, since I know you haven't read it and maybe some other people who have read The Dark Tower haven't managed to read that book either, what happens is in one of the stories, they are basically going after Ted Brodigan, who will appear in the next book. And they kind of just drive around looking like suits, so like FBI guys basically.
Yeah.
So they know how to blend in, and the fact that they appear in this too, you're kind of like, oh no, because it's the low men and vampires who are there.
Right. And I think this is the first time that we've seen both of them in anything other than a flashback.
I would say up until this point, yes.
But with the low men, they can pass as human except for the fact that they have this red spot on their foreheads.
Right.
Which Mia has the kind of realization that that's how they're breathing, because it's actually a mask. It's a facade. It's not what they actually look like.
Yeah, and I think a lot of them end up wearing hats for that reason, to kind of cover that up.
Right. I don't know what I was expecting under the masks, but when Mia does manage to like rip one off, I was not expecting the description to be a rat man.
Yeah, they look very rat-like. It's not pretty when you look at the pictures.
No, I'm glad I don't have any pictures because it sounds terrifying.
Yeah, and they are pretty ruthless too. Like if they are sent after someone, they don't give up. And
No.
the fact that Susannah is then being held by them and vampires, which for anyone who has read Salem's Lot, you know how persistent they can be as well.
Right. They also are 100% cannibals, which is another terrifying aspect of what they are.
And that's why Jake and Father Callahan go into it not thinking either of them will make it out alive.
Right.
Because they know how dangerous these quote unquote people can be. You know, obviously they're not real people, not your everyday person, but I think that's a testament to not only how brave Jake is, but how far Father Callahan has come even just since the beginning of Wolves of the Calla.
Yeah. Because, I mean, he isn't a gunslinger.
No.
This isn't what he does. He just somehow kind of fell into the quartet with them when they showed up. So this, I mean, Jake gives him the gun and is like, do you know how to shoot this?
Yeah.
I'm really mad that we don't see them actually go into the Dixie Pig, to be honest. This whole book was just kind of building towards like an epic showdown. And I, like you said, there are mini battles throughout it, but I was just like ready for that one big fight and they didn't get it. And I was a little disappointed.
Yeah, it's weird because with this series so far, it feels like some books give you so much information and so much happens, and then other times it feels like things have slowed down a little. So, like in Wolves of the Calla, we had the sort of main two storylines, and when they were in Caliburn Sturgis, things seemed to move a little slower. Whereas with The Gunslinger, you have Roland constantly moving in that book. So even though it might have been a slow start to the series, I think the fact that he was constantly moving and introduced to Jake that way, and they had this whole journey, it felt different than staying in one location.
Yeah.
And in a sense, all of these characters stay in roughly one location. Like we mentioned, Jake and Father Callahan are in 1999 New York, and then Roland and Eddie are in 77 Maine, and they pretty much stay there the entire time.
Yeah, everyone is kind of stuck where they are. Eddie and Roland are trying to find a way to get to New York and to Susannah, which is all Eddie can think about, pretty much, which makes it kind of surprising that he's the one who suggests that they seek out King.
Yeah, and that's their like one big task for this book, whereas Jake and Father Callahan, they're trying to get the vacant lot. They're trying to find Susannah, and they have a little more going on, I would say, than Roland and Eddie, which again is different because Roland takes the lead on so many other things in the 5 previous books.
In this instance, Eddie kind of takes over and is like, no, we have to do this.
Yeah.
And it kind of shows how much Eddie has grown to have Roland say to him, like, okay, I trust you. Like, we will go.
In a sense, it almost feels like the drawing of the 3 was the book where the most happened, because you have Roland trying to find Eddie, find Susannah, you have Jake, and he's really just bringing the entire group together. And then from there, you know, you have like Wizard and Glass, where a lot of it is flashback. So there's no real movement for the characters themselves. It's just a lot of information for Roland's backstory.
Yeah. Those like stories within a story where all we really get are flashbacks.
Right. And don't get me wrong, I still really, really enjoy this series overall. I think it's just interesting how different each of the books are from each other.
Yeah. There's a lot of variation in kind of how the stories are told and what the focuses are from book to book, which is nice because it does keep it interesting as you go through the series. And like the first couple books, I think I've mentioned in past episodes, I wasn't necessarily a huge fan of. But as the series goes on, I've grown to really enjoy it.
Yeah, it's one of those things where maybe book to book, you don't really understand the significance of the previous book until you read the whole thing, kind of.
Yeah, I feel like I'm going to read the last book and suddenly a whole bunch of different things are going to make sense.
Maybe.
Maybe.
I can't say for sure because I still have The Wind Through the Keyhole to read, and I don't know how much that is going to play into what happens between books 4 and 5, and if it's going to make something else click for me. But I will just warn you that the 7th book is packed.
Yeah, I kind of figured it's pretty large. And there's just so many loose ends that need to somehow come together and get tied up in that one book. So I kind of figured that it's going to be a doozy. I wish that his books didn't end on such cliffhangers.
Yeah.
Like a couple of these books in the series, specifically, I forget which one it is, ends with them riddling on Blaine the Mono.
The Wastelands?
Yes. Now, Song of Susannah, they feel so abrupt in how they end.
Yeah, not to mention the way that all of the other books tie into the Dark Tower. Like, because you hadn't read Salem's Lot, you needed a little extra context for Father Callahan.
Right. Although, on the other hand, it did make the ending that much more of a surprise for me.
Fair.
Whereas if I had read Salem's Lot, maybe I would have picked up on Father Callahan and his story earlier. And while it would have been kind of useful in reading it, it did make for a nice like moment at the end where I was like, oh, like that's going to be an interesting thing that they have to play out now.
Yeah, and this really is King's Lord of the Rings. I know you brought up that series before, and even though Lord of the Rings is only 3 books plus The Hobbit, if you want to count that, this is much, much longer in length, and I think it's more convoluted too than The Lord of the Rings, but it's definitely like his epic fantasy tale that sort of acts as the center point for his universe.
Yeah, and King as a character brought that up himself in this book, which when that showed up, I was just like, yeah, see, it is Lord of the Rings. Also, just like, I know you say The Hobbit, if you want to count that, like, I very much do count that. It is kind of like the precursor to the series in the same way that The Stand is the precursor to
Right.
the Dark Tower series, which I don't know that I will ever be able to read The Stand again. That was a long one.
I know. I have the edited version, which is the one I read for the podcast, and then I found the newer version, which is basically like the uncut edition or whatever they call it, and it's like 300 to 400 pages longer. And I was looking at it and I was like, all right, this is 50 cents at the library, so I am going to buy it. And I don't know when I will be in the mood to read it, because I feel like once I'm done with, catching up to King's current releases, I'm going to need a very big break from King books.
Yeah, I feel like that's fair for you. You've been reading a lot of them. Part of me wants to go back and reread The Stand after having read the Dark Tower series, just to see if there's things within the Dark Tower that I did not necessarily pick up on that were like callbacks to The Stand. But I don't know that I will have the emotional energy to do that.
Yeah, maybe you can just watch the CBS All Access series this December.
Yeah, there we go.
And if you're feeling adventurous, watch the one from, 94 too?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
But yeah, is there anything you want to touch on with Song of Susannah that we didn't get to just yet? I know that these episodes have maybe been a little shorter than the Dark Tower series should garner, but I feel like with this one, it's like a lot happens, but at the same time, the story doesn't advance a ton.
No, it just kind of brings us that little bit closer to the epic conclusion.
And also, to be fair, this is a shorter book than the last couple have been, at least.
Much shorter. This one, my copy of this one was, I think, 540 pages.
Yeah, the hardcover, I think, was 432 for me, whereas Wolves of the Calla was in the 700 range, I want to say. And I have a large paperback for book 7, which basically it's a hardcover, but it's not a hardcover. It's, hardcover size, but a paperback. And that one, okay. 845 pages.
I have to look. I don't know. I just have a paperback. I got all of them in the same
printing.
Yes. Because when I have like a series on my bookshelf, I like to have them all look the same. So I don't know how many pages this one is, but it's a pretty hefty paperback.
Yeah. It was to the point where my arms would get tired holding the book to read it, which is kind of sad.
They're heavy.
Yeah, I was like, am I this out of shape, or is this book actually just really heavy?
No, they're big. They are large books and dense, and there's a lot going on and a lot of Easter eggs that I don't necessarily pick up on, but I know that they exist.
Yeah, one thing I will say, since you brought up the cliffhangers in the last couple of books, they are very effective, though. And I wonder if the cliffhangers hit a little harder, I think, in Wolves of the Calla and Song of Susannah, simply because King knew all 3 books were coming out in a row.
Maybe.
Because it really felt like those endings did hit harder. Because I can barely remember the ending of the others at this point, and I don't think they were like too terribly important. It was just like, okay, on to the next thing.
Right. He talks about like the cliffhangers too in those journal entries at the end. And I don't know if these are like real letters he actually got as an author, but he includes letters from fans who read them and were angry or upset over the cliffhanger in Wastelands and the fact that he doesn't complete the riddling with Blaine and he leaves it to the next book to pick up. And part of me was like, I agree with these people. I'm really angry right now. But also, I have the next book, so lucky me, I do not have to wait to continue.
Yeah, that's the nice thing about doing this the way I'm doing it for The Dark Tower, at least. I don't have that excruciatingly long gap. It's like, yes, I have a pretty big gap between the books, but because I'm reading them all one right after the other, pretty much, it wasn't 8 years or whatever insane number of years it was.
Right. Which I feel like is a very long time in between books if you're writing a series.
And the thing is, I think The Dark Tower was like one of the first things he started writing, too.
That would make sense.
And that's why it's such a crucial series in his body of works, because it ties into so many other novels. Whether or not those other novels are as good is wholly up to whoever is reading them. I know there are some that tied into the Dark Tower series that I just did not really care for quite as much as I do some of his other books. And it's a lot when you look at everything in its totality.
Right. It would make sense that Dark Tower was one of the first things he started writing because of, like you said, the fact that so many of his other books kind of tie into it. I didn't realize that, like, the turtle was a recurring thing for him.
Yeah. And because Salem's Lot was his second published book, you have to figure he had these plans for Father Callahan for quite some time.
Right.
I don't think it was an accident that he showed up in the Dark Tower series after appearing so early on in King's bibliography.
Right. Do you know if there's any like truth to the story that he tells Roland and Eddie about how he had an outline for the series and then lost it?
I don't know. It might be in like his on writing book, and maybe I just don't remember that story. The only story I remember specifically about him, quote unquote, like losing something was when he threw Carrie in the trash and his wife Tabitha plucked it out of the trash and made him finish it, basically.
Right.
I think that one is such a big story that I don't recall if anything about the Dark Tower came up in on writing, but that is something I will have to look into now because now I'm curious.
Yeah, I just thought that was interesting, and I was just curious how much of like his personal experience with writing this series actually made it into the book and how much of that is just him kind of fabricating stories.
Yeah, because he has on writing, like I mentioned, and then he also has one called Dance Macabre. I haven't read that one yet, but it's kind of similar. And then I think there's even like a third book with essays on writing or something. I think it's called something along the lines of Secret Window, something or other. It's a play on one of his other titles.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't read any of these.
I think you would definitely like at least on writing because that's the one I've read, so that's the one I can speak to because he goes into sort of what inspires him and what his process is like. And for someone who has written as many books as he has, even if you haven't read a majority of them, that stuff's always interesting to me. And this is like a total side note for anyone listening still, but I really love when people talk about their process because even though it's something that doesn't work for everyone necessarily, it's always pretty intriguing to me at least.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, well, I think that wraps up our thoughts on Song of Susannah. There's probably something I'm forgetting, or I'm simply forgetting it because I think it's part of book 7, and I don't want to spoil anything for you, but Becky, like I said, I know you won't be on for book 7, but you and I will definitely be texting while you read through that book, I
Yes.
imagine.
Yes, and I plan on jumping into that and just kind of keeping the momentum going, because I know if I stop and I don't just start reading it now, I won't pick it up until you're like, "Hey, are you ready to do Wind Through the Keyhole?" And I'm like, "Wait, I got to read Dark Tower first."
Yeah, and you don't want to rush that one.
Right. So I want to make sure I give myself enough time. And also now I want to just see how this all kind of wraps up, because they've been toying with this idea of what I'm going to call a multiverse for the last couple books, and how there are different worlds and each one is just slightly different. But now kind of introducing King as the author of everything that's happened. I am very curious to see like how that plays into the Dark Tower itself and what's going to happen and how it ends.
I will say that reading book 7 definitely makes some other things make more sense to me within the Stephen King universe, which might not apply to you since you have no plans to watch or read it or things like that. But there are certain things where I was like, oh, okay, I understand where these other things came from now.
I might try and dive into some other stuff once I get through with these. You never know.
That's fair. But I think the ones I have recommended to you before don't tie into the Dark Tower.
Okay.
But if you can handle vampires, definitely read Salem's Lot.
I think I could. I might give it a try. Especially now that I know, like, Father Callahan as a character outside of Salem's Lot. I might want to try and see what his actual book is.
Yeah, and that one's not too terribly long. But Becky, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this one. I've definitely been enjoying our journey through these books.
Me too. Like I said, I'm excited to see how this all kind of wraps up.
Yeah, me too, since I still have the Wind Through the Keyhole to read. I mean, it's like technically wrapped, but technically not.
Right.
All right, that does it for this episode of Chat Sematary. You can support the podcast on Patreon for $1 a month. You'll get a thank you on the show. For $2 a month, I will send you a Chat Sematary sticker. And if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so at Chat Sematary on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You could also rate and review the show. That's a huge help. And as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.